Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And I have over 13 years of collective experience in social work and another 5 years as a therapist. And in this video, I want to talk about a few notions. I want to talk about the let them theory and that book, as well as Sam Vatkin's notion of the flying monkeys. And then I want to also talk about Stoicism and also the notion of the smear campaign that can often occur within family dynamics, like dysfunctional family dynamics. So I'm going to talk about these notions and tie them all together. The primary focus is to consider the smear campaign. So that typically occurs when the narcissist recruits certain people to do their bidding. And so in the 90s, Sam Vatkin coined the term the flying monkeys. And so you can consider these, pesky monkeys or, creatures, I guess you'd say, that are nipping at you and not usually that big, right? Don't have a lot of power, but are meant to distract Dorothy and be a pesky kind of annoyance, but are an extension of the narcissist, or in the case of Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West. And so, yeah, Sam Vatkin coined the term flying monkeys in the 90s. And he makes a distinction between three types of flying monkeys. There's the ones that don't know any better or don't know that, what's occurring. So, maybe in a very harsh term, you can call them useful idiots. So they don't know kind of what's going on. They're more just manipulated and coerced by the narcissist. There's also the ones that are like look for drama and are actually just seek drama, and so they're good to play along in some sense. And then there's the true believers. So these are people that are like in the cult, so within a cult dynamic. And so these flying monkeys, it's basically the notion within the smear campaign is typically the flying monkeys will come at you to either put pressure on you or to like kind of take you off your game in some sense. And it's interesting because in this process you'll find the people that you'd consider used to be, someone you trust or thought that they trusted you and you trusted them, turn out to be more easily persuaded by, usually it's this case is the parent that's more narcissistic. And so this can be very hurtful because these are people that you've probably known for several years, and you'd assume that they would know you and trust you and have your back. And it's one of those things that's not even worth really responding to in some sense, because that's the notion of the smear campaign as well, as the notion that it's better to not defend, explain, or argue, because actually that's just what is going to lead for it to become worse. And it's in these dynamics, especially if you're scapegoated, where let's say the target or the victim is arguing or defending or explaining, then it tends to exasperate the anxiety within the system and then make the identified patient, if you take a more Bowen lens, to be seen as the crazy one or the one with anxiety or mental health issues. And often, especially if the narcissist or the dysfunctional family dynamic is wanting to seek out discrediting the victim or the identified patient, then this plays into their narrative. But by going silent and not responding, one, it goes back to this book by Mel, Let Them Theory, is just the notion that you let people have their reactions or their emotional reactions. And so she talks about in that book about emotional maturity as well. So you could just consider, like she says, a majority of people are at an 8 or lower in terms of their development emotionally. And if you just consider that, people are like kids. And so some people, like a lot of people, I guess, in the world, right, don't really have the emotional maturity. So if you grant that, she just talks about let people have their reactions. And so she talks about emotions and what emotions really are. And there are reactions in the psyche, right, that usually happen in just a few seconds, like 5 to 7 seconds. You have a spurt of dopamine or of neurochemicals that make you feel something, and then in those responses, typically we're not always conscious of it, and so we have those reactions. But most people aren't even aware or take ownership of those reactions. So and usually could be through a trauma lens, considering that they're just responding from their trauma. And so there's a notion of the intergenerational process, and so we could go into that. But so the flying monkeys can play a part in that notion of transmission process and be doing the bidding of the narcissist. And so that book is just a good reminder, I would say, of a lot of things to consider when, if you're on the receiving end of the smear campaign. Obviously, so this also goes back to Stoicism. So, I think it's, so within Stoicism, they talk about, I think it's Seneca, where it's like you don't have control of your reputation, your body, your property, like things that are not of your own volition, you ultimately don't have control of. And so that too with people, right? So that's why, a lot of this is just, what to say, they're common abstractions, but important abstraction. And an important abstraction in this sense is the notion behind letting other people have their reactions and just knowing that you don't have any control or responsibility over that. And, that's obviously simple in some sense, but I think it is a good reminder in terms of just our own mental, emotional health, because, if you let people have their freedom to have their reactions, and then the other part of that book is let me, and so she just talks about putting emphasis and attention and effort back on the self and building oneself up again, and or just having calmness and wisdom within oneself. And this also goes back to a Stoic understanding, right? Is ultimately that's how you gain dominion over oneself and have so Stoicism just talked about that, and it was very I would say there was virtue ethics and different aspects of that theory, but the backbone of that theory or that approach, that philosophy, is the notion of what is your responsibility, and so and also about mindset and how to think about that. So the Letman theory is similar in that regard. So she's just giving you the reminder that, especially with emotionally mature people or difficult personalities, that you can let them have their response and then you focus on yourself. But typically, if you're exposed to that kind of person over time, and you're living with them, then it's not as easy. I would say that I think you have to almost be a saint to not have some form of reactions, and so Sam Vatkin actually goes into that as well. And that's just how do you survive in that? And so some people have more of a fight response, and others are more just accept that this is their faith kind of thing. But anyways, the notion is the smear campaign, and the best thing to do is not respond, because your silence is your answer in some sense, right? Or it's let the silence haunt them in some sense, because truth ultimately wins out, even if as cliche as it sounds. But I think you can't argue with reality, right? And some people can fool people for some time, but not all the time. And so that's also a good reminder. And you also find out who your allies or who your true friends are in this process usually. So in this video, I highlighted just some aspects in terms of understanding the smear campaign, and I walked through the notion of flying monkeys that was coined by Sam Vatkin in the 90s, and how those pesky creatures or animals can take you off your path, or distract you from your purpose, or just, you can understand, I think, these types of people. And if you take those three perspectives in terms of the three types from Sam Vatkin, that's, I think, also helpful. And then I also talked about Mel Gibson, her book, Let Them Theory, and that's helpful, I think, to understand what ultimately you have control of. There is the Jade technique also, so that's don't justify, explain, argue, or defend. And that can be also an important reminder. And a lot of these principles, I would say that they've been spoken for several, centuries, if we take Stoicism. And so Mel Gibson's book, Let Them Theory, and just some of the advice provided by Sam Vatkin speaks to this, that ultimately, you go focus on oneself and what you have control of. Often when people are stressed or have a lot of anxiety, that's one of the first things you come back to. And within Stoicism, there's a notion of we suffer more in our minds than we do in reality. And especially if you're one to catastrophize, you're definitely going to be, especially if this is a smear campaign and you don't, you're gaslit or your reality testing's off, or your self-esteem's low, then yeah, you're likely to spiral more. But if you first understand it's the mind and it's the way in which you don't have, like, just figuring out what you have control of and then coming back to that, because it's a good way to anchor yourself and ground yourself in what you know to be true, and your reality testing, right? Read Seneca. He has a great book on meditation, so that's him journaling to himself. And in that process, you learn a lot, I think, about how to think about mindset. And so he was speaking about, obviously a much more difficult time and being an emperor. And so it's a good short book. A lot of, I would say, there's been an upspring or a general movement of people getting into Stoicism. So some people say it's not always emotionally, some people are too stoic maybe, or they like shut off their emotions. So there's also considerations of that. But you can also take Let Them Theory, or consider reading that book. Check out the book or the video by Sam Vatkin about his coining of the term, the flying monkeys, and the different types, and also his advice around what to do when responding to the smear campaign. Yeah, I would recommend journaling, of course, because I think it's good to be clear and articulate on paper what you're going through. You could also consider the mantra, like let them, let me, and just to kind of unburden yourself from the pull from the smear campaign. And sometimes it's just as easy as just marking down on a calendar, right, the days you went no contact or you didn't respond. I think that's also helpful. And also connecting with friends that really do have your support.